Hello again, everybody. I hope you're doing well. In today's video, we're going to be talking all about local adjustments in Lightroom Classic, how to create them, how to tweak them, how to save presets for them, all so that you can become a master of them. I'm going to be covering a lot on this one, so I'm going to break this up into chapters in the description below. Otherwise, for the sake of time, let's just get going. So first things first, let's talk a little bit more about what exactly a local adjustment in Lightroom is. A local adjustment is any single tweak or even multiple changes that you make that are controlled to affect only a particular part of an image. This is opposed to global adjustments that you make within the main develop panels, which apply equally to the entire image. Using a local adjustment is going to allow you to really control your processing and fine-tune everything from exposure, color, texture and clarity, to sharpening and noise reduction by applying changes only to a specific or quote-unquote local section of an image. So with that, let's do a quick overview of where to find the local adjustment tools and the different types of local adjustments that we have available to us. Okay, so as a starting point, here we are in Lightroom Classic. And to get to any of your local adjustment options, you simply come into the upper right corner of your develop panel and you'll see next to the crop, spot removal, and red eye correction tools, the next one over is your first local adjustment, which is graduated filter. Next to that is your radial filter option. And the last option you have for your local adjustments is the adjustment brush. As you hover on these, you can also see some shortcuts to just jump directly into these. So for graduated filter, you can just hit the M key to immediately open a radial filter. It's Shift plus M. And to start an adjustment brush, simply press K on your keyboard. So let's just click on this first one here, the graduated filter. And as we come in here, we immediately see that we've got a mask option at the top, which is new. And then currently grayed out is edit and brush. And then you have an effect menu here, which is where you can get into some basic, essentially preset options that Adobe's provided within this tool. So if I click on this and expand this menu, you can see you've got an option or a quote unquote preset for any of the sliders that are built into these local adjustments. Now it's not quite on par with what you have on the global adjustment panel, but one bit of good news is with the latest Lightroom update to 9.3, they did add a hue adjustment in here, which hasn't been available and has been something that people have been clamoring for quite a while. So again, Adobe continues to listen to feedback from users and is continually rolling out some updates and new functionality. So going on down this list, you get into some presets here that are both from Adobe as well as any presets you've made for yourself for local adjustments. And these are fairly self-explanatory: burn, dodge, darken or lighten, iris enhancement, some skin adjustments, and then there's some of these that I've added in here as well. And I'll show you how to create your own presets for local adjustments later on in this video. If we jump out of the effect menu, you've got your usual slider adjustments that you're used to using within the regular develop panel in Lightroom. And this allows you to make one or multiple tweaks using all of these sliders as you create your adjustments. Now, a quick tip also that you want to keep in mind as you start playing with these is if you get into an adjustment and you've got a whole bunch of these sliders that are tweaked and moved all over the place, and you decide you want to reset them, you can either double click on each individual slider to reset it to 0, just like most sliders within Lightroom, or an even easier way if you just want to reset the entire panel is simply come up to the word effect and double click on that, and it's going to zero everything out for you. So keep that in mind as you start playing around with this, because occasionally you will get into it where you just want to completely reset and start making your adjustments from scratch. Okay, so if you recall, we've already got the graduated filter adjustment selected up here. So this is what we're going to be creating first. And if I go down into the effect menu, I can either choose one of these different options. And let's say I just want to adjust part of the image's exposure. I can simply click on that. Now you'll notice this jumps all the way to 4. So something to keep in mind here as well, let me just double click to reset this, is that your local adjustment tools basically remember the last setting you used. So in preparation for this tutorial, I ejected the exposure all the way to the right on this. So when I came back in here, it was already set up to 4. So keep that in mind as well. If you're getting confused why an adjustment's not doing what you want it to, you've just got to continue to make sure you're looking at those adjustment sliders. And again, you can double click on a single slider to reset it or double click on the effect title up here to reset all the sliders. Now, for the sake of these examples, I'm going to be doing an extreme adjustment on the exposure so you can clearly see what I'm doing with these local adjustments. As with anything you're doing in Lightroom, most likely you're going to want to be focusing on more subtle adjustments. Certainly not cranking your exposure all the way up to 4, or all the way down to -4, whatever the case may be, but this will help you visualize how each of these tools interacts with your image. So first things first, when you come out to your image with your graduated adjustment selected, what you're going to want to remember is that the direction you pull from is the direction from which you're going to be starting at essentially 100% opacity on the adjustment, and it's going to fade out in the direction you are pulling. So let me just show you exactly what I'm talking about. It's easier to see it than explain it. So if I click and drag from this right side of the image and drag towards the left, you can see that I'm creating a gradient or a graduated adjustment on the image, and it's fading towards the direction in which I'm pulling. So I'm pulling to the left, so it's fading out and getting lighter, eventually going to 0 adjustment from right to left. Now, if I come in here and delete this real quickly, you'll see that the exact same concept applies no matter what direction you're pulling from. So if I'm pulling from the bottom to the top, it's going to start at 100% at the bottom and gradually fade out as it moves up towards the top. You can also drag on an angle to create a gradient that's not parallel or perpendicular to one of the edges of the image. Okay, now jumping back to the image with nothing on it in terms of the graduated adjustment filters. Watch as I start creating this. When you first start dragging it, it's going to be very intense and almost no gradient at all. So as you pull it out, you're creating more of a subtle and softer gradient, or more feathering on the gradient. So if you watch that, we're going to a very narrow band. And as I pull it across, the gradient becomes more and more feathered out across the image. All right, I've reset the image back so that there's no graduated adjustments on it. Now, the other thing you may have noticed is you drag this, it's a little touchy. It can be hard to keep it exactly straight. So if you do want to create an adjustment that's perfectly parallel or perpendicular to one of the edges, simply go in and create it, but before you start clicking and dragging, hold down the Shift key on your keyboard. Keep that held down as you start to drag. It's going to keep it perfectly straight at 90-degree angle to the bottom edge here, pulling from the left, or perfectly parallel with the left edge that I started from. Same exact concept applies if you're pulling it up from the bottom or from the top. Hold down Shift and keep that key pressed down as you drag. It's going to keep your adjustment perfectly straight and level. This is really handy if you're trying to do an adjustment along a straight horizon line or something like that. You're not having to worry about finally controlling the exact angle of it. Lightroom's going to help you keep the exact angle you need. Now, let me delete this one out, and we'll come back over. So right now, this adjustment I made previously is not selected. You can tell because that little adjustment pin essentially is just a solid gray dot. If I click on it, you see the little black insert or enter dot appear. That means that's my active adjustment. So if you've got multiple adjustments in an image, you're always going to know which one you're actually working on, because it's going to have that black dot within the gray dot. So if you're trying to adjust this left one and you start playing with the sliders and you can't figure out why it's not making the adjustments you want, simply look for your gray pins here and find the one with the black dot. So if I wanted to adjust this one, I'll simply come over and click on it. And now any adjustments I make will apply to that. The other thing here is you may notice as I move my mouse into the menu, those adjustment pins disappear off my screen. So I've got this set up so that the edit pins automatically show when I need them and automatically hide when I'm trying to just look at the image. I find that very convenient because it takes some of the distraction away as I'm working on the edit. But if you click on this little menu down in the lower left corner, you do have the option to have the pins always on, so no matter what you're doing, they'll always be visible. Or you can choose to have just the selected pin visible, which I never use because then you can't find your other pins. You can have them never visible, but again, I personally prefer auto. If I want to see the image without the pins on there, especially if I'm doing some local brush adjustments or something and I've got a lot of pins, it can get really distracting. So all you've got to do at that point when it's on auto is move your cursor over into the menus, either on the top or the bottom, and they'll automatically disappear. And then when you go back into the image to start working again, they'll pop back in. Now, obviously, you can see the effect of these different pins. And let me delete out these couple extra ones here so I can show you the next little piece. So again, I'm just going to click on this gray dot. Also, you just noticed as I hovered on this, the red overlay popped on to show me exactly what part of the image I'm impacting with this adjustment. The other thing you can do is come down and show the selected mask overlay. That's going to leave it on as you work. And then one of my favorite shortcuts is just hit the O key. Even if you're not hovering on it, when you hit the O key on your keyboard, it's going to show that overlay. Hit it again, it's going to turn it off. So if you just want to see really quickly where exactly you've applied an adjustment, and again, this is especially helpful when you're working with the brush tool, just clicking that O button on and off essentially is going to let you show what parts of the image you're working in. As far as the adjustments themselves go, they're pretty straightforward. It's basically the same as your regular development panel tools, so you can change your temperature. So as I slide this right or left, you can see that adjustment is changing drastically as I make wild swings on this. Same thing with your tint, contrast, highlights, so on and so forth. So again, most of your basic panel tools are available here, but you're not going to have things like the tone curve or split toning and things of that nature. Some of the more advanced tools aren't available in here, but they did just add in this hue slider. So if I use this now and I start playing with this, essentially where you drag this is where you're changing the color to. So as I drag this to the right, in this case, that little gray slider is essentially pointing at the orange and on into the yellow. As I pull this back to the left, now I'm turning this adjustment back to my basically starting point when you get back to 0. And as I continue to pull this to the left, I go into my blues and greens, yellows, and back over into orange. So this is the newest piece that they've added into this with Lightroom 9.3. And then if you want to really have a little bit finer control on this, because it moves pretty quickly, simply click this Use Fine Adjustment box, and it's going to move that cursor much, much, much slower. If you watch the numbers versus where I'm moving my mouse, it's giving you much finer control over that slider, so you're not swinging it too quickly and moving past the color that you're really trying to hone in on. Let me turn that off and double click to reset. Now the other cool thing you can do here is if I hit the O button to turn on the mask, you can see that right now I've got this adjustment equally applied across the entire left side of the image from the sky down into this foreground rock. And let me actually pull this out. So as I pull this to the right, you see I'm impacting more and more of the image. If I'm dragging on the pin itself, I'm moving the adjustment as it's currently set. If you come out and hover on the outer edges or these lines on the outer edges of the graduated adjustment, and you click and hold on those, now you're going to be impacting the feathering or the amount of gradient that you're applying with that adjustment. But anyways, the really nice thing that you can do with these is you can come up to the upper right here and currently run our edit panel. But if I click brush, that's going to give me some brush tools down at the bottom here that you don't otherwise have accessible to you when you just go into the default setup for one of your local adjustments. So within here, I have a brush A option and a brush B option. So what that allows you to do is set a different standard size, a different feather, and a different flow for each of these brushes. So now if I click over to B, you'll see that those sliders have changed and my brush size has changed. But the key here is it also gives you the ability to erase from within this adjustment. So you're not stuck with just what's on the screen here. You can actually come in here and erase out parts of this. So if I wanted this nice gradient applying from left to right just in my water, I can come in here and simply start deleting out parts of this adjustment. Now you may be asking yourself, well, gosh, Mike, you're sitting there brushing and brushing and brushing, but nothing's happening. So this is where you need to watch what your flow is set to. So I've got the flow set to a very low value of only 10. So what the flow is essentially doing is if you're thinking of, say, ink on paper, it's how much ink is coming out as I make a movement on this adjustment. So now you can see I've raised that flow and I'm starting to remove more of that adjustment as I erase over it. So you can come in here and we're just going to do this quick for example's sake, but I can come in and erase this out from where I want it. If I adjust that feather, I can reduce the amount of feathering around the actual erase tool. And let's say I want to erase this out from up in the sky and come down to the water level here as well. So now I've got that gradient effect, but I've removed it from parts of the image where maybe I don't want that actually applied. So just a nice little tip of how you can really, again, fine-tune one of these graduated adjustments that you've applied to an image that's only impacting the part of the screen you want. If we come back over to the right panel here, you'll also notice that there is an additional menu down here for range masking. This is one of my most used tools within local adjustments. I basically use it on, I'd say, at least 50 to 75% of my local adjustments. But I'm going to cover that in a separate video. On this one here, I just want to worry about the basics and help you understand how you can use local adjustments and what the different tools are within them from just a basic standpoint. Okay, I've got the image reset here. Let's jump into part 2 of this tutorial, which is the radial adjustment tool. So if you come back to the upper right, you'll see you've got your radial filter option. I can either click on this or hit Shift plus M on my keyboard to create a new radial adjustment. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a click. And just like before, you can click into that effect menu and choose from any of the different slider options within here. And it's going to remember what you had set on the sliders for the last time you used them. So again, I'm on this exposure slider. It's remembering that the last time I used that exposure slider, it's at +4 on the overall exposure adjustment. If I wanted to reset that, simply double click and it's going to put that back to 0. Again, for the sake of this tutorial, let me slide this all the way to the right so that you can see what I'm doing. So the first thing you're going to want to understand about these radial filters in Lightroom is the difference between having this invert box checked or not. So if I come out to the image and I click and I start dragging, I am creating my radial filter. And since I have the invert box checked here, it's putting that adjustment on the inside of the radial that I've created. So think invert inside. If I were to untick this box, now it's applied the adjustment to the outside of that circle. And if I turn the feathering down here, you can see that a little bit more clearly. So now if we look at the image, we can see extremely clearly that the adjustment is being applied to the outside of this radial filter. And again, if I were to tick the invert box, it's going to invert that. And the adjustment is going to be contained within the radial filter that you've just applied. Let me turn off that mask by hitting the O key so I can see the exact adjustment I'm doing here. So now you also just saw me mess with this feather slider, which adjusts the harshness of the edge of the radial filter. So whether I'm on an inverted radial filter or a non-inverted radial filter, the further I slide this to the right, the softer that gradient is getting from the borders of the radial filter. And again, if I hit the O key, you can see this is fading out very gently from the center of the image since I'm inverted to the outer edges. And if I flip this back so that it's not inverted, it's working inward from the outsides of the edges of the image towards the center, where by the time it gets to the center, you have no adjustment at all. So a good way to think about this, if I turn this mask back off, is let's say I wanted to use a radial adjustment to create a custom vignette essentially. So I want a vignette on this image, but I want it centered on these trees back here, whereas with the main vignette option in the develop panel, your vignette is always going to be in the exact center or based on the exact center of your image. So now if I come out here and I start dragging my exposure down, you can see that I'm essentially creating that vignette. And since I don't have this inverted, the center part of this image where I've got the pin is not being impacted. Now I can start dialing this in with feathering to get it to a point I'm happy with. And with this, you can play with any of the sliders to get the exact effect you're wanting in that offset vignette you've just created. So just a real quick little tip there of an example of what you can do with these local adjustments within Lightroom. Now let me delete this out, and just like with the graduated filters, if I hold down the Shift key as I start creating a new radial filter, it's going to give me quote-unquote perfection as I create it. In the case of the radial filter, if I click and hold Shift and click and start dragging to create that filter, it's going to give me a perfect circle for the filter as I create it. Let go both the Shift key and your mouse cursor, and now you've got a nice perfect circle right wherever you've placed it within your image. Again, if I flip it so it's not inverted, that perfect circle is going to be still in place. The other thing this lets you do is, let's say I've clicked one of these and I've decided, you know what, I don't want a perfect circle on this, but I want more of an ellipse. Now I've created this ellipse and I can rotate it and do whatever I want by hovering kind of outside of the little grab points on the ends. That's where you're going to adjust the size of the radial adjustment in any of the 4 directions. So if I want to make it, in this case, taller, I'm just going to click and drag up. If I wanted to make it narrower, click and drag down. I can make it longer by clicking the left or right pin here. But let's say I've got the shape of it dialed in, but now I actually want to make it bigger without changing the actual shape. Now if I hold down the Shift key and I drag on any of those pins, it's going to make the entire adjustment bigger without actually changing the shape. So to run through that again real quickly, if I click and hold Shift as I create the radial, it's going to keep it in a perfect circle. Conversely, if you just click and drag, you can create any kind of shape you want as you drag it, as long as you're not holding down that Shift key. If I've decided this is the exact shape that I want, I just want to make it bigger, Well, I can't do that if I just click one of these grab points by default and start dragging it. It's going to change that shape. So if I want to keep the exact shape and just make it larger, again, hold down Shift on your keyboard, keep it held down as you start to drag on any of those points. It's going to retain the exact shape you selected and just make it bigger or smaller as you click and drag with that Shift key held down. And the last thing here is just, again, just like the graduated filter, you can click on the brush option in the upper right panel and have those same exact brush options available to you. So brush A, brush B, and the erase option. So if, again, you wanted to come out here and just change this a little bit, pull some of the adjustment back out of the image, you can do that. And conversely, if you wanted to add it back in, you wanted to keep this exact adjustment. So I've got the exposure cranked up to 4, and I like it where it's at within the radial, but I also want to add some up here. That brush tool is going to allow you to take that exact same adjustment that you've created and apply it to other parts of the image. All right, I've once again reset the image back to square one. We're in the home stretch here. The last one we're going to cover is the brush adjustment. So once again, come into the upper right corner, and now you have the brush adjustment tool up here. Simply click on it or press the K button on your keyboard to create a new brush adjustment. Just like the prior two, you've got your same effect menu, so nothing's different in that regard. Everything's going to work exactly the same as what we've talked about. But there are a few things you can do within this brush tool, and I've touched on a couple of them already, but I want to take a deeper dive here so you really understand the power of what you can start doing as you start playing with the brushes. So again, for the sake of this example, I've got the exposure cranked all the way up so that this is very easy to see. But first thing I want to walk through is the difference between your feather and flow and density options. And this is going to look familiar to you. It's the exact same brush tool layout that you saw in the graduated filter and the radial filter. As with those, you've got an A brush, a B brush, and your erase option. Size is pretty straightforward. You can click and drag on that slider to change the size of your brush tool. A couple little shortcuts on that. If you've got a scroll wheel mouse, you can also scroll either up or down to change your brush size. That's how I do it. It's nice and easy and quick. The other option is you can use the left or right bracket keys on your keyboard to adjust your brush size as well. But again, for me, I've got the scroll wheel on my mouse, and I find that's the easiest way to quickly adjust the size of a brush as I'm working within the image. I also touched on you've got your A and B options. So if I have my size set to roughly 40 on my A brush, and my feather is set to 70, and my flow is set to 100, I can come into my B brush and have a completely different setup for that brush, which comes in handy as you're working with this adjustment brush. Maybe there's parts of the image where you want more or less of it applied. You can quickly jump back and forth between the A brush and the B brush to have separate settings. So typically what I'll do is just like I have here, my A brush is going to be basically up to 100 on flow, and feather is probably going to be kind of a midpoint, and then size will be whatever I'm using it at that time. And then on my B brush, I'm going to have a much lower flow. So maybe I bring the flow down to 25 or 30 on my B brush, and my feather is, maybe a little bit higher at 80. It doesn't really matter. Just play with it, see what you need. You can tweak it from image to image or whatever you need to do. Now, the difference here is if you watch the cursor, as I change the feathering, you can see that outer ring is getting smaller and smaller. As I drag it to the left, as I drag it back to the right, that outer ring gets larger and larger. So that's going to be how much the brush is feathered as you apply it to your image. So now for the sake of example, I've got the feather at 100. Let me drag the flow all the way up to 100 as well. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But if I come out to the image, you can see as I drag this across and start painting in, it's got a very, very soft edge along the outside of the brush that I've just applied. As you bring this feather down, it's just like that radial adjustment. It's going to create a softer edge around your adjustment as you're adding it to the image. So if I take it all the way to the left, I have no feathering. I'm going to get a very defined line as I paint this in with zero feathering. So let me come up here, right click and delete this. All right, so I've got that adjustment deleted. Let me come in here and we'll set our feather up to midpoint. And let me show you the differences on flow. So right now flow is at 100. So if I come in and I draw in, what this is essentially saying is I'm getting the full output of the brush as I swipe it back and forth. So you can see that as I go back and forth, I'm changing the area I'm impacting, but I'm not making the adjustment any more intense as I go back and forth on this. If I bring the flow down to roughly midpoint and I do the same thing, now as I go across, you can see I'm getting a much fainter line. And as I go back and forth, I'm painting in this gradually, bit by bit, until I get up to the equivalent of that 100 flow. This comes in really handy when you're trying to just paint in a very subtle effect and you don't want to overdo it. It also allows you to use a single adjustment pen for multiple levels of that adjustment within an image. So maybe part of it you do want 100% flow, but another part you want a little bit less of that effect. If you keep your flow lower, you can paint it into the exact level you want. And if I come over here and I drop this way down, let's go down to 10, as I start painting this in, it is extremely subtle and you really have to just paint back and forth to get that effect brought into the image. So that's what your flow is going to be doing for you. So let me turn flow back all the way up to 100, and I'm going to delete this out, and we're going to talk about this density slider. So the density slider is essentially going to set a cap or a max limit of how strong that effect is going to be. So if I leave flow at 100 and density at 100, and I draw my line across, it's the same effect we saw before. Now as I drop my density down and I drag across, I'm getting essentially half the effect. And no matter how many times I draw back and forth on this now, I can't make it any stronger. So even though my flow is at 100, my density is preventing me from going any higher than 52. Now honestly, I don't use the density slider a whole lot, but this is what it's going to do for you if you do opt to use it. Another good example of how it can come into play is if I pull my flow down, and let's say I go to roughly 30 on flow, and I leave that density at 52. Now as I paint across, I'm gradually painting in that adjustment because I've got a very low flow. But as I paint it in, I'm never going to be able to go above that 52 on my density still. And I'm brushing, but it's never going to let me go all the way up to 100 in terms of the density or the impact to the actual image. So now if I come in here and I drag this density back up to 100, and I start painting in, you can see I'm able to get a much stronger effect on the image because I've turned that density up. So like I said, I don't play with the density slider a whole lot, but this is how it lets you, again, have further control over the adjustment you're applying to the image. Now you also notice that I'm doing all of these different adjustments with just a single adjustment pen here. So I've got 100 flow, 100 density. I had 100 flow and basically half density or 50 density. And then I had a low flow and that lower density. And then I had back to the 100 density and a low flow. So I could paint it in and bring it into the full adjustment range, essentially, of how I've tweaked this adjustment with the various sliders. Now let me clear this out and we'll move on to the next little tip in here. So you'll also notice in this panel for your brushes, you have an auto mask tool. So this can be useful, but you have to be careful with it. So auto masking is essentially going to let you paint in an area of the image, and it's going to mask along an area of a sharp difference in contrast. So this mountain range is a great example. I've got a relatively dark mountain range against a lighter sky. Now let me turn auto masking off real quickly just so you can see the difference it's going to make. So if I come in here and I say I want to lighten the mountain, but I don't want to impact the sky, well, that's going to be really hard to do. As I start painting in here, I'm either going to have to go with a really small brush and try to paint in exactly, which is difficult. I could zoom in, and you can zoom in a couple different ways. So when you've got your local adjustments active, essentially, and you're working within the local adjustments panel, you can't just click to zoom, but you can. So if I just hold down the space bar and now I click up here, I can zoom into whatever my last zoom selection was. If I zoom back out, the other way you can do it is just simply come over to your navigator. You've got your usual zoom selections here as well. So spacebar, click, zoom in. So again, I can use a really small brush here and try to just paint this in very carefully along this edge, but it's very, very difficult to do. So I don't recommend that. But if I delete this out and I try it again, but this time I turn on auto mask here in the lower right, essentially what it's going to do is, as long as the center point of my brush doesn't cross that threshold from dark to light, Lightroom's going to do as best as it can to keep my adjustment within the parameters of the darker area because I'm not crossing my cursor into the light side. Now let me turn my flow up here so that we can see exactly what's going on here nice and easily. So now if I come along this edge of the mountain and I start brushing in, you can see it's not going into the sky. And it does a fairly good job, but you'll notice there is a problem. And you can paint back and get that in there a little bit more fully and try to fill in some of those gaps where it's maybe not painting it exactly as you'd like. But you'll notice it's not perfect. So I don't use this very often at all. There's other tools you can use to help you refine a mask like this. And you can do it. I could zoom in even further and really get close in there and make sure I'm not crossing that center point of my adjustment brush into the lighter part of the sky. But the other problem I have here is it's impacting the brush in terms of the interior of this mountain as well. So now I got to come back here and I got to brush back over these areas to make sure I don't miss any of them. And I've got to brush on this little dark area and make sure I don't miss that section. So you have to be really careful. And usually when I do use this, I use it just along an edge like this. And I get my edge defined nicely. And I can paint this in. You can still see there's some jagged parts along the edge that's missing, but for the sake of example, let's say this masked the way I wanted it to along that edge. Now I'd come back over, turn off auto masking, and I can paint in on the interior part and not have to worry about painting into that sky anymore. So it can be a useful tool. Unfortunately, its usefulness is limited with some of those little misses in the masking, whatever you want to call it. But it's worth knowing that it's there because it does come in handy from time to time. Okay, let me turn auto masking back on here and show you what you can do with the erase tool. So if I'm painting on the mountain, and again, as long as I don't cross that center point of my adjustment brush into the sky, it's not going to paint there. But let's say I get sloppy and I accidentally bring it out into the sky. Now, obviously, you can Control Z to undo that move, or maybe I need to come in here and I want to erase. So I'm going to come back to the lower right, click on Erase. Same concept as your other brushes, so you can adjust the size, or you can use your cursor to adjust the size or the brackets. You can adjust your feathering, your flow, and on Erase, you don't have a density option, so you can only affect your flow. You do have auto masking as well. So now if I turn on auto masking, I come out here and I say, oh, I messed up. I need to remove this from the sky. Same principle. As long as you don't cross that threshold from light to dark, your erasing is not going to move into the mountainside. So the auto masking can be pretty useful on erasing, in some regards more so than it is on the actual brush adjustments. The other way you can erase is without having to come in and click on erase. So let's jump back over to my A brush. If I'm out here working in the image and I want to erase, I don't want to have to keep jumping back and forth between erase and A and erase and B and back out to my image to make the adjustments. So all you have to do is hold down your Alt or Option key, and now you've got your erase tool readily available without having to go back over to that panel. And this I use all the time because it's a nice little time saver. You can see here too, is I've got auto masking turned on, and it's not erasing things out fully, because there's variations in contrast, so I'd have to come back in here and really in detail go over each of these little sections to erase it out. Or I can come in while I'm still holding down Alt or Option. It's going to keep my erase tool active. So while I'm holding down that key on my keyboard, untick Auto Mask, continue to hold down the Alt or Option key on the keyboard, and now I can come out and it's going to erase it. Okay, let me click Done. And we're going to zoom back out. I'm going to come in here. I'm going to add some more brush adjustments. So right now, this is no longer my active adjustment. You can see that the pen is solid gray, which means it's not active. So if I click out into the image now, it's going to create a new local adjustment. I've still got that auto masking on, so you can see it's doing some funkiness. So now I've got a second adjustment. If I wanted to come back over and work on this one, I would just click on it. Now it's got the black dot in the center, so anything I do is going to be the exact same adjustment as this one. Now, not really clear why this matters here, but let's say I had a color hue change on this adjustment, and I wanted to do more of that over here. Now I've got two adjustments in here, and they're doing different things to the image, so I need to make sure I'm working on the proper one to either add in or erase parts of the adjustment I really want. If I wanted to just change the exposure on this one, I can select it, make it my active one, and I can tweak that exposure. If I wanted to come back to this one and click on it, and let's say I wanted to change that hue, I can do that, and it's going to only impact my adjustment on this pen while leaving the other one alone. Same exact concept applies for your graduated filters and your radial filters. You can also tell what you're doing by looking in the little upper right portion of the local adjustment panel here. Either Edit or New is going to be highlighted. If Edit is highlighted, you know that you've got one of your existing adjustments actively selected. Whereas you can click on New, or if you saw New is already highlighted, if you click out into the image, it's going to create a brand new adjustment for you. So now we've got multiple pins on here for the brush tool. And again, same concept if I had multiple radial filters applied or multiple graduated filters. When you're working within one of the three local adjustment types, you can turn that type of adjustment on and off with a simple click of a toggle switch. So if I wanted to turn off all of my brush adjustments, I'm going to simply come down here to the bottom of the adjustment panel and turn off brush adjustments. So now with one click, I've turned them all off, and I can see essentially what my before was versus my after with the local adjustments, in this case, the brush adjustments that I've applied. So that same toggle is available for your graduated adjustments and your radial adjustments. Now the downside to this is it turns all of the adjustments of the same type on and off. You can't turn off individual ones with a simple flick of a switch or anything like that. But if you haven't already, take a look at my video that covers adjusting the local adjustment opacity. In that video, I walk you through how to take a single adjustment pen. So in this case, I've got 3 brushes, but if I wanted to turn this one off, that video is going to walk you through how you can turn off just this one pen while leaving the other 2 still active, so you can see your before and after for your most recent adjustment or one single adjustment, as opposed to using this toggle switch, which is going to turn them all on and off. Now let me delete these out. And the last thing I'm going to show you here is how to create a preset so that you can use a particular adjustment you've created in the future, either for the same type of adjustment or even across your other adjustments. And that is one thing to keep in mind as well. So actually, let me delete this out real quickly and we'll create a new radial adjustment here. So let me click and drag and make this adjustment. And let's just say we like this pink, and we're going to turn the clarity down. We're going to turn the dehaze up. Now let's pretend I'm really happy with this adjustment that I've just created, and I want to be able to use it again in the future, or I want to use it on a graduated filter and have it match exactly. There's not a way to copy a local adjustment from adjustment type to adjustment type. Now with the brush, you can obviously do it because you've got the brush option on your graduated and your radial filters, but I don't have any way to take this from a radial filter and apply it to a graduated filter in a different part of the image. But what I can do is I can come into my effect menu and I can save my current settings as a new preset. So if I click on that and I name it Pink Glow and click Create. Now if I come in here and I click on the graduated filter, you can see Pink Glow is available to me and it's already pre-selected. So I'm no longer working in the radial, but I can come in here. And we've got some color mixes going on here, but regardless, it's the same adjustment on this slider here. So you can see color for color where it's overlapping with the darker blue of the water. It's doing the exact same adjustment for me. Now circling back a little bit, let me delete this out. That also leads to something else you can do. I said you can't copy an adjustment from type to type. So I can't take a radial adjustment, the exact settings, and copy it to a graduated filter. That's why we have to create that preset to be able to use it on a different type of filter or to be able to use it in the future. But what you can do when you're in the same local adjustment tool is if I hover on this and right click, you've seen I've been able to delete them, but you can also duplicate it, which is going to basically double your adjustment. So in this case, I'm basically going from +4 on exposure. Now I'm going to +8. If I were to duplicate it again, it's going to make it yet again even more intense, and you're really getting some funkiness in here. But you also are creating additional pins. So now I can take and drag these pins elsewhere into the image. And I have the exact same sliders, but I've now got 2 additional radial adjustment filters that I can move around the image as needed. And this might very well be the worst image I've ever created. But hopefully you get the point. It's very easy to duplicate within the same type of local adjustment. You just can't duplicate a radial adjustment into a graduated adjustment unless you do that preset trick I just showed you. Now before we wrap up here, let me show you one last cool thing that you can do with the regular brush local adjustment tool. And let me clear out these other sliders so it's not quite so garish as we're looking at it. But just like with the graduated filter and the radial filter tool, the shift key is going to give you a modifier to help you create quote unquote perfection. So if I hold down the shift key on my keyboard and I click to start my adjustment and I keep that shift key held down and I click in the image again, it's going to draw a perfectly straight line across the image. Let me show that again. Let me turn off auto masking this time, and we'll turn off feathering as well. But again, hold down the shift key on your keyboard, click once in the image, and now it's pulling in across my image from my last point because I'm still on the same adjustment pen. So again, if I hold down shift and click, I'm creating a zigzag pattern from each of the points I've clicked in the image. If I wanted to create a new line, I would just come up here and click new in the upper right corner. Again, shift and click, keep the shift key held down, click again, nice perfectly straight line in my image. And you can get creative with this as well. Let me delete these out. If I shift click to start the process, you can come in and you can change your brush size. You can even come over and change your feathering or even your flow. And if I hold shift and click again, it's still doing that straight line, but now it's taking it from that starting point and it's created a nice tapered and essentially feathered line across the image here. So in this case, it almost looks like a flashlight coming out across the water. Conversely, I can come in and do a new one. And let me shift and click. And this time we're going to turn our feather back down. We're going to turn our flow back up. Shift and click again. And you can see I've gone from a soft edge to a harder edge, and that flow is also adjusted across it as well. I don't use this a whole lot, but I do sometimes use it to accentuate existing sun flares in the image or something like that. It allows you to just hone in and match the flare as it goes from narrow and spreads out and gets softer as it spreads out from the point of light as well. So that's one last little trick you can do with the brush tool. You can use that on the brush tools within the graduated and radial filters as well. So again, it's creativity, it's playing around. Nothing in Lightroom is permanent, so play and have fun and try out different things and see what you can find within the tools. They're going to help you fully realize your vision as you work on processing your images. Whew. All right, this one was a bit of a doozy, but hopefully you're coming out of this video with a much deeper understanding of how you can use these local adjustment tools to really fine-tune your processing. Also, don't forget to watch my local adjustment opacity video that I've put out there for some additional tricks on what you can do with these adjustments. Hit the like button if you found this video helpful, and go ahead and subscribe to my channel as well to continue to follow along as I release more videos in the future. As always, thanks for watching. Let me know if you got any questions, and I'll do my best to answer them in the comments section. And until next time, take care, everybody.